hello, everyone. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the story of Assyria. This is our third class. And if you have been with us, you know that the focus of this class or these lectures has been the various non-Assyrian views about Assyrian history. So it's kind of an interesting way to look at Assyrian history. And I want to begin. We're going to talk about various authors, Greek and Roman authors in particular, that told us about our history, that created a lot of some perhaps truthful, some perhaps fictional accounts of Assyrian history. And these filtered down to us to this day. And we're going to look at a few examples. But I want to begin with asking my dear colleagues, Sarah and Pierre, a couple of questions that will also lead you to think a little about this as we go through the class. Sarah, the Greeks and Romans told us about Semiramis, and I grew up hearing about Semiramis, Melikta Shamiram, a great deal. And this story that was created is thought to be rather fictional. All of these authors that wrote about her, Diodorus and others, Tasius and others who wrote, and even Dante, who later wrote about her, were thought to be not truthful. It was mythical. Or was it? Is this story mythical, according to you, Sarah, as an Assyrian? What is your perception of this? And what is your view, your idea, your thinking about this phenomenon?
Thank you for the questions. From what I know, Diodorus, he took a lot of inspo from Titius, and then yes, he created his own historical record. But as I mentioned to you earlier, it's conflated between history and the use of literary tropes. Shamiran is kind of like fantasized and romanticized and becomes this like really like big warrior queen who essentially becomes legend. But I know that the story goes on that she was born of a goddess and somewhat divine, raised by doves, essentially founded Babylon, yada yada. But the point is, his narrative kind of reads more like a sort of literary heroic folklore to make the story a bit more compelling than the historical account we know today. But I don't know. I feel like he is more concerned with building up this legendary individual who embodies beauty, power, and cunning as well, which is a common trope used on women in older literature. I mean, even the Roman view of Cleopatra. I mean, these types of tropes have existed even in later literature, like Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth. So I do think that these authors really embellished her reign and mythologized it essentially. But it's kind of interesting at the same time to see how these depictions of her kind of like cling to our memory. Even when modern studies kind of proved it to be myth, we still kind of like clung on to the image of Shamiran as, you know, the super cool like conqueror warrior queen. I mean, we know that she did have a level of influence acting as queen regent, and she appears in some inscriptions. And I think there are inscriptions that kind of suggest that she had involvement in military campaigns. But I guess it's just how people want to remember their past and how others want to kind of imagine it. But yes, I think memory, legend, and history, they're all kind of being blurred here in an interesting way. My view is that this phenomenon, I mean, it really just extends beyond Shamiran. It's kind of about the power of storytelling and how stories can last for generations. I guess in a way, I can't be too mad about their ancient fascination with Shamiran, because it kind of requires us to look more closely and critically today to kind of understand her better. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would like I'd like a follow-up question. All right, so what you're saying is there might be some underlying truth, some perception by these various authors stretching in time regarding women. But as an Assyrian, how do you feel, more specifically as an Assyrian, that your history is being used as, I mean, I used this word before. I don't mean to, you know, use it lightly, kind of a prop to make a point, because Assyrians have been used as a prop. The evil guys of Hollywood, the not just Hollywood, but the many thousands, I would say millions of pages written on how bad the Assyrians were. So knowing what you know about Semiramis through the writings of um, uh, Tasius and Diodorus and others and Dante, how do you feel as an Assyrian?
I mean, there's bad and there's good. Obviously, it's not the best to have like an inaccurate historical record, but at the same time, I feel like, at least for me, I feel like a big part of why modern Assyrians today really look to Shamiran with such fascination is probably mostly because of these Greek and, Roman sources that have been passed down, so that their memory kind of clings on to us, I guess, whether we like it or not. um but yeah.
Okay. You're not getting as mad as I want you to get mad. So I'll go to Pierre. Just kidding, Sarah. Um, Pierre, these Greek and Roman authors also wrote about Ashurbanipal, and usually many scholars say that's actually Sardanapalus. That character is Sardanapalus. There's some question as to that. And what they stated about him, that he was effeminate, he was negligent, he was basically a bad king, not a very favorable view. How do you determine reliability when you look at authors such as Tacitus and Herodotus and others when it comes to Assyrian history, Pierre?
Yeah, let's look at the period in which these people were living. First off, these Greeks were living quite far from Mesopotamia in a time far after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. They didn't know much about Assyria, right? They knew Assyria existed. They obviously knew that this was quite a grand empire that existed before the Persians. But what they knew about its kings, its rulers, its culture was relatively limited. Very few of these Greeks ever visited the region to know anything about it, let alone were able to read Akkadian to know any actual historical records. So these people were not quite the most qualified to be interpreting history about the Assyrians. But what they were doing was telling a story or making a sort of moral judgment about the Assyrians in order to put it in a way that their readers could understand, or make a warning about what these empires stood for or what they want them to. They're projecting a lesson, projecting a moral lesson onto them. We also have to remember about these Greek authors is a sort of oral tradition of kind of continuing these things. So let's say Theseus was the first. A future historian is going to be referring Theseus's account about Sardanapalus. Even the character of Sardanapalus himself, while we might understand his name of being a corruption of Ashurbanipal, uh, whether whether or not that was even the same person, like you said, is not. We don't even know for sure. In fact, I think a lot of authors, when looking at this critically, or historians look at it critically, Sardanapalus seems to be a blend of what the fall of the Assyrian Empire sort of represented to them. Moral decay. How do empires fall? How could such a great empire fall? Well, it has to be a weak ruler. I mean, even in Greek philosophy, with Plato, you see the whole idea of the philosopher king, that we need to have this king who's virtuous. So On the opposite side of that, you have to portray, why does an empire fall? It has to be a king who's not virtuous, who's not a warrior, who's not a true king. And that's how they want to portray Sardanapalus. Personally, if you look at this from any sort of historical record, you have to view it as unreliable, because the Greeks in general portrayed any group who were not the Greeks as barbarians. And the Romans were in the same sort of sense. The Romans, because they can't have any ideas of their own, copied the Greeks and sort of continued this trend of, if these aren't from our neck of the woods, these people are barbarians. The East, barbarians. Where did the Persians inherit this barbaric ideas from? Well, their predecessors. It's just a very common way of thinking at the time, and it's just ahistorical. I mean, now that we have people who are Assyriologists, people who study Akkadian, people who study the language, I mean, it's been shown that these accounts have little to no connection to the ancient Assyrian Empire. There wasn't kings dressing up as women who, when their city of Nineveh was about to fall, decide to kill themselves and start a huge funeral pyre, like they say about Sardanapalus. This was not how the fall of the Assyrian Empire occurred. Now, were there weak kings? Of course. But is this an exaggeration? Absolutely. I brought this up in the first episode. We talked about how the Greeks described one of the Medes, one of the kings of the Medes, who kills his advisor's son and forces his advisor to eat him. Harpagus is his name. Did this really happen? Probably not. But what do the Greeks want to teach with this? It's propaganda. It's propaganda. And this is very, very common in early history, or what we call history these days.
So you're saying they're kind of like otherizing, as to use a word, kind of a recent trope. They're otherizing the Persians, the Assyrians, as Eastern kind of barbaric people.
Yes, the Orient is a beast for them.
Back to Orientalism.
Back to Orientalism. It all comes back to that. You see a sort of early version of Orientalism here, and obviously this is an idea we see in the 18th century and 17th century when Europeans start to visit this land or write about this land. I mean, some of the things they write about people there are almost mythical, right? In the same case occurs here with the Greeks. I mean, it's easy for them to try and explain, how this great empire fell and how they chose to understand Eastern peoples. These people are decadent. These people are failures. These people are unable to have a great society like we are able to. They have to fall. But let's take the lessons of how these people fell and let's understand it, and let's understand it from our point of view. I'm pretty sure Theseus wants to write for dramatic effect. That's typically how it is. I mean, even Herodotus, when he writes his beginning of the Persian Wars, he tells a bit of a tale of a king who's very rich, who lives in that land, on the border on the coast of Anatolia. So this is a common Greek storytelling trope that they tend to have with kings and decadent kings and failures and moral inadequacies. This is just generally how they tend to tell stories.
Well, this is definitely a good observation, and I think that we're going to go through various authors and kind of hone in on some of the authors and try to understand where they're coming from. Some are pre-Christian authors, Herodotus and others are Christian authors. And so we're going to have a look at all of them, and then we'll go all the way up to Hollywood and see how Assyrians have been portrayed, and then let's kind of ask the question afterwards. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Pierre, for those wonderful answers. A quick note about the sources, and what we used to do in the previous classes is provide students who wanted it the sources for each class. I was just recently asked. Of course, there's what I talk about is based not on just the sources that you see here, but also on kind of a lot of background information. And so we're happy to provide these sources for you, but there are a number of articles that are very interesting. One is Andre Heller's Why the Greeks Knew So Little About Assyrian and Babylonian History, what Pierre was talking about. And Eckhart Fromm's book talks about Semiramis. And there's also Koi Mi-jian's article on Van and its travel accounts, and he's talking about kind of the Armenian version of Semiramis, how this tale has gone to the rest of the world, really. Um, and then there are others, tons of other books that we can talk about and discuss, and we will be hitting various sources in class and going over them, like Olmsted's book, like Sagg's book, The Might That Was Assyria, and like Eckhart Fromm's book. So with that, let's talk about some of the historians that we're going to be dealing with. Herodotus is certainly a very important figure in all of this, and and I think he's one of the critical people who really begin in his histories, and he promises to write a book on Assyria, a volume on Assyria. We never get to it, or it's lost. Historians don't know, scholars don't know. Tasius of Cnidus is another one who wrote in the 5th century BC. Xenophon. Pierre, you mentioned people who did not go to these places. Xenophon fought in the service of one of the Persian kings, and he actually supposedly visited these areas, although a lot of scholars think that he didn't make good observations in his Anabasis and Cyropedia. Diodorus of Sicily is a very important writer. If you're looking for the story of Shamiram, that's really where it comes from. Diodorus did quite a job on Shamiram's story, and Diodorus's story is based on what Tasius wrote about Shamiram. There are others, of course, Plutarch, Strabo, and Lucian of Samostia. And these are all authors who have written about the Assyrians, who wrote in Greek largely, and there are others who wrote in Latin about the Assyrians. They mention Assyria. So there is this idea that Assyria kind of disappeared from history and it wasn't really mentioned. And the Assyrians picked up this idea, modern Assyrians picked up this idea of Assyria from the Bible, really. But what we're seeing today is that that's not true at all. There is kind of a continuous history after the fall of Assyria as to the Assyrians existing. Nobody says the Assyrians have disappeared and are no longer here. To the contrary, all of these authors assert seemingly that Assyrians continue to exist in their land. So we're going into the Christian centuries and beyond. And we see references to Assyria that are continuous. So where do the Assyrians come into contact with the Greeks is kind of an interesting question. And really it happens in Anatolia, in Cilicia, where in kind of southern Anatolia, where the Greeks southern central Anatolia, where the Greeks kind of settle in various places. Remember, there's a long history to these kinds of settlements going back, I would argue, to the Iron Age collapse over 1000 BC, where people were moving from the west towards the east. And then later, of course, we have movements from the east towards the west. So that's where we get the Mongols and the Turks and so on. But people have moved always. They're moving. And even if empires have immigration laws, and just as we are very strict about right now, people do move. People move around. There are migrants and have always been migrants in history. who have moved for various reasons. Either it is persecution or it is economic movements. So Greeks often settled, as did other people living on the coast, the Eastern Mediterranean coast, for example. What we know is the Phoenicians, which are really Canaanites, moved all the way from what is Lebanon into Carthage. The Greeks moved from various Greek places into Anatolia and into the Eastern Mediterranean. So they came into contact with the Assyrians. And there are various reports by various Assyrian kings that Greeks served. Of course, the Assyrians called the Greeks Ionians or Ionae, and they had served in various um, uh, army units of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians also contested Greek domination and forbade them from being in certain places. Now, in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, remember that the Assyrian king perceived himself to be the ruler of the entire Mediterranean area, not just the landmass that you see where the Assyrian Empire was, but he had power beyond the sea and beyond the sun, all the way possibly to Spain. So this was at that time the known world. So there were contacts between Greeks and Assyrians. There was interaction. And one of the very first to write about the Assyrians among the Greeks is Herodotus, who is known to us as the father of history. He, of course, his main focus was not the Assyrians. He promised, as I said, to write a history about the Assyrians, but he covered the Greek-Persian wars and the cultures of the Near East and talked a lot about Egypt and the Scythians, and he talked about Assyrians. He mentions the Assyrians frequently and views Babylon as a province of Assyria. He views the city of Babylon as not in Babylonia. That's a term he does not use. He uses, he views Babylon as the largest city in Assyria or in the Assyrian Empire. And others see that as conflating the two. He saw the Assyrian Empire as a great body, large entity, and Babylon was one of the cities of Assyria. Although he doesn't always name Assyrian kings, he does refer to Assyrians and the people of Babylon, but he does refer to Sardanapalus. He refers to Sardanapalus specifically as an Assyrian king, but does not say anything bad about Sardanapalus, what the question posed to Pierre we addressed. So Assyria had many great cities. Nineveh, of course, was one of them, but Babylon was the most famous. Remember, when Herodotus is writing, Babylonia and Assyria, what is known as Babylonia. By the way, this term, I keep saying in class, this term never really existed in the language of our people, our Semitic speaking people. There's no such thing as Babylonia. There's Babel, which is a city, but there's no such thing as Babylonia. This is an invention, later invention, and a distortion, I would say, of Greek and Roman authors. This is one region, really. And I brought up before we started class that even at the time of the Sasanians, the entire region of Mesopotamia was called Asuristan, according to the Sasanians. Now, why did they call it that? Where did they get this idea? And a lot of people say, well, really, they were talking only about the area of Babylon and they were mistaken. Well, they must have gotten it from somewhere. So we see here the kind of the early references to Assyria as being larger than what is known as the Assyrian Triangle or the heartland of Assyria, which is an area from the city of Ashur, say, all the way to Nineveh and to the city of Erbil, that kind of area. But other authors see Assyria as a much larger entity. He tells us of King Sennacherib and his campaign against Egypt. He recounts the fall of Ninus. There's a reference to Ninus and the decline of Assyria. Ninus is the king of Assyria, according to Herodotus. he talks about Sardanapalus, and this is the first time that this word appears in Greek history. And what is Sardanapalus known for? His wealth, his power. So Herodotus refers specifically to a chamber that he creates underground of immense wealth and perhaps a tunnel. And Sardanapalus is robbed. But he doesn't talk about how Sardanapalus is a bad king or a negligent king or an effeminate king. There is no such reference. That comes with later authors. Assyria falls to the Medes, but Babylon remains an independent as a province of Assyria. And he says in his book, they took Ninos and brought all Assyria except the province of Babylon under their rule. So Babylon is seen as a province of Assyria. That's how Herodotus saw it. And according to Herodotus, Sardanapalus was, as I said, extremely wealthy. King of Assyria, who dug a chamber where he stored his treasure, but thieves managed to break into it. From Tasius onwards, Sardanapalus becomes as a decadent, effeminate king. Okay, but that's not in Herodotus. That comes later. Where does that come from? Where did Tasius get this idea of this effeminate Assyrian king? We're not sure. By the way, he's both effeminate and he has concubines and so on and so forth. So, bottom line is, Sardanapalus is not a very good king, and he doesn't pay much attention to his kingdom. Well, also writing and having visited Assyria was Xenophon. And Xenophon wrote much later than the time of his travels. He wrote years, perhaps a decade after he had traveled. He had been a mercenary in Mesopotamia and Persia, and he portrays Assyria through a moral lens. He sees Assyria as a powerful but a decadent empire, and he's partial towards Cyrus, just like a lot of people are still now. When they mention Cyrus, especially Iranians who talk about the great moral power of his rule and the human rights advocacy of Cyrus. Now, this was not what Xenophon wrote, but Xenophon saw Cyrus as an upstart king who was energetic, and he viewed the Assyrians as kind of decadent and way past their prime, as it were. The Assyrian Empire is, again, according to authors, conflated with Babylon. And of course, it's very important to remember this, that idea. Some people say conflated, but others say that this was their perception, that this entire area was Assyrian. In fact, we'll talk a little about, maybe at the end of the class, about this confusion of the Syrian-Assyrian dynamic. Where did this come from? And why was the word Syrian sometimes equated with autumn or Aramaean versus Assyrian? We'll come to that because that's caused, obviously, a lot of conflict within the modern Assyrian world. So the Assyrians.
Sorry to interrupt, Robert. I was just going to even say on Xenophon, he mentioned in North Mesopotamia when he's during the Anabasis, when he's with his troops, that they're near these ruins of large cities, and it's become purely villages. There's just villages around it. The great glory of these old cities is lost. But this also serves as a point to Assyrian continuity. To be honest, when you see that while the empire has fallen, the people still remain, around these cities. It's just from urbanization has declined in the region. Instead, you've started to see things become more rural. They talk about this in Patricia Crone's, why am I forgetting the name of her work? Hagerism, that Assyria has become a rural province. Obviously, Xenophon sort of contributes to this understanding of it, but it's another good point to bring up about Xenophon and his understanding of North Mesopotamia.
Yeah, absolutely true, and very good point. Actually, his account is very contested by many other authors, including, by the way, archaeological digs, where there's very, very clear signs of population growth. So he may have traveled one way to understand it is he may have traveled a certain way and come across certain cities in ancient Assyria, especially the great cities, let's say Nineveh, which I think he refers to as Mashpila, Mushpilla, fallen in the modern Assyrian language or in the Aramaic language. But people say, a lot of people, including scholars, Stephanie Dali, that he was really mistaken as to a lot of stuff. And he was writing much later than his experiences. So there's a lot of questions. Um, but really, again, Pierre and dear class, this is really looking at the Assyrian Empire through a very moral, I would say, Western lens, and very biased Western lens. Um, I will ask you one question at the end of this presentation, which is going to be important. When you see something being said, how much weight do you give to who is saying it? When you see a perception being formed like xenophones, how much weight do you give to who is saying it, and what do you look at? So keep that in mind as we go through many of these authors. Ctesias, of course, of Knidos is a very important person in the formation of Assyrian history as it's come down to us. He was a physician in the Persian court, in the Achaemenid court, and he wrote Persica, a history of Assyria and Persia, which is known from later compilations because it's only survived in fragments. And Diodorus is the one who writes a lot based on this particular author. He writes extensively about Ninos, Shamiram, Semiramis, and Sardanapalus. His version is highly legendary, according to most authors, according to most scholars, often contradicting known Assyrian records that are now being viewed, but extremely influential in shaping later perceptions of the Assyrians, including, as we're going to see, modern perceptions. Created a certain Oriental prototype of the Assyrians and themes that have proven extremely powerful and lingering throughout the modern times. And he's responsible for painting a picture of the Oriental ruler, what we know as the Oriental despot, okay, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and the kind of the archetype of the Oriental effeminate despot, which is Sardanapalus. So according to Ctesias, this is the way he saw it. This is a quick graph. Ninos is married to Semiramis. They have a son named Ninias, who's not a very powerful king. And then there are 30 generations of inactive Assyrian kings, although the power of Assyria survives. And then there comes Sardanapalus, who's the last of the Assyrian kings. And Sardanapalus burns in a fire. And now, oftentimes, some scholars believe that this may be conflating the story of the brother of Ashurbanipal, with whom he fought a civil war. Remember that Sarhaddon appointed his son Ashurbanipal over the throne of Nineveh, which was supposed to be kind of the heart of the Assyrian Empire, and his other son Shama-shum-ukin, on the throne of Babylon, and he was supposed to be kind of secondary to Ashurbanipal. Why did Sarhaddon do this? There's a whole long story, and we'll perhaps discuss it in class, or we can discuss it a little later. There's a wonderful lecture that was given by Assyrian Assyriologist Shayna Zaya on this topic, the Brothers' War. But he appoints his son, and so there's a civil war that is fought, and Shama-shum-ukin, the brother of Ashurbanipal, the older brother of Ashurbanipal, rather than giving up, burns himself in his palace, And Ashurbanipal actually references this, that fire took his brother, and it is thought that he perished because he committed suicide. So could this be a conflation with that story, a misunderstanding of that story? Perhaps. And perhaps there are other pieces of literature that we can put together, tracing it to Ctesias and others, and Diodorus, perhaps. Now, as we said, he influenced later writers. His themes run throughout the writings of various Roman and Greek authors. One example is Paulus Orosius, who was a Christian and who wrote in Spain, and his writings are come from a Christian perspective. He also writes about Ninos, and of course, by now you should know. I should clarify that Ninos was not a historical character. He's a name given to an Assyrian king, just like, for example, in the Old Testament, there's a reference to Pharaoh. Which Pharaoh is it? We don't know. Moses refers to Pharaoh. And there's a reference to Ninos. Is Ninos a name of an Assyrian? Does it come from? Well, certainly it has some Assyrian origins. Nineveh, Ninsun, and so on comes from a Semitic Akkadian word, but there is no such king as Ninos. But he is placed by Orosius as a contemporary of Abraham, and that's very interesting. So going back a long, long time, allowing for both Ninos and Semiramis to enter late antique and medieval chronicles. In his account, Ninos expands his empire through 50 years of warfare, and after his death, Semiramis, his former wife, succeeds him as a powerful and victorious queen. And there's a lot of bad things to say about Semiramis. This narrative echoes earlier versions from Ctesias, as we said, and Herodotus. Not so much Herodotus, more Ctesias. However, he adds a moralizing Christian layer. He emphasizes Semiramis's sexual immorality, and this has gone into later portrayals of Semiramis, portraying her as driven by lust and sleeping with many and killing her lovers afterwards. This negative image has strongly influenced how she was viewed throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and we'll reference Dante's Inferno and his reference to Semiramis being in hell because of her bad acts, as it were. Diodorus gives the most detailed narrative, and it's based on Ctesias. He recounts the founding of Nineveh by Ninos, close there, the names, the legendary expansion of the Assyrian Empire, and the heroic acts of Semiramis. He describes her building projects, which later we will see an Armenian author writing about her building projects in Van, which is in southeastern Turkey today, in what is considered Armenian areas. Military conquests, including campaigns into India, and her status as a semi-divine queen, especially after she passes. He sees the Assyrian Empire as the first of the world empire, so nothing came before Assyria, and offers a long dynastic history. Again, it is legendary history. So his view of Assyria, just to kind of simplify here, is Assyria is the first empire. The key figures in the empire are Ninos, Semiramis, and then later, the last is Sardanapalus. Rise through conquest, decline through decadence. There's this theme, as we talked about in the beginning, kind of like focused on there's this truth in history. If you are decadent, you're not going to survive. So there is this throughout these legends that decadence causes decline. The style of writing is a mix of legend, Greek moralism, Orientalist tropes, what we now call Orientalist tropes. Of course, we owe that to the late Edward Said, who was a professor and wrote the very book on Orientalism and shaped our understanding of it. Diodorus's views shaped later views of Assyria in Christian, medieval, and Renaissance historiography. And now back to Polus Orosius. He was a Christian priest. He was a theologian in Spain, what is known as Spain and Portugal. Best known for his historical work, books of history against the pagans. Now, why is he writing that? Obviously, these are early Christian centuries. Assyria, again, is the first and most brutal of the pagan empires, led by aggressive rulers like Ninos. Again, Ninos comes through well-known Ninos and Semiramis and lays the foundation of the Assyrian Empire. Again, account is less historical in the modern sense and more theological and moralistic, using Assyria as early symbol of worldly pride and destruction, and comparing it to Rome. So Assyria is the oldest kingdom. Ninos is the legendary king of Assyria, often conflated with Nimrod, mistakenly, because of the Bible. Ninos is not mentioned in the Bible, by the way. Ninos, king of the Assyrians, he tells us, was the first of all to make war upon his neighbors and establish an empire. So, truth be told, the Assyrians were really the first to establish the empire. So that layer of truth comes through here. He's supposed to have reigned for 52 years, and he is supposed to have founded the city of Nineveh. Semiramis is his wife and his successor. She's powerful and ambitious ruler, and she is a very uniquely a female warrior, something often treated with suspicion in ancient and Christian history, and definitely at this time. And he tells us after the death of Ninos, his wife Semiramis succeeded to the rule of the kingdom and achieved many great things with a woman's daring. He calls her. She has woman's daring. And, that's, of course, his view of how Semiramis was perceived. Again, his view is instead of 30 generations of warrior Assyrian kings, instead of 30 generations of previously kind of lazy kings, he talks about 50 generations of warrior kings, and then comes Sardanapalus. So it begins with Ninos and Shamiram or Semiramis, and then various generations of Assyrian kings, and then the negligent and effeminate Sardanapalus. Well, when he looked at history, and this is something that we need to talk about, he didn't simply see Assyrian history in a vacuum. He viewed Assyrian history as having said something to us, to him specifically, to him as a Christian. And he talks about the fall of Rome and the fall of Babylon, and views Babylon as a part of Assyria. Mark well how similar were Babylon and Rome, yet how different were their decline and fall. For while Babylon lost her rule, Rome retains her rule. The one was left desolate by the murder of her king, meaning Sardanapalus, and the other is secure with her emperor unharmed, because in Babylon, the punishment for the shameless passions of her people was visited upon the king, whereas in Rome, the serene, even temper of the Christian faith and Western faith was preserved in the person of the king. So kind of Western view, kind of what we call Orientalist view now of the Eastern despot, the Orientalist despot, the lazy, incapable, decadent king in the East, cruel, merciless, whereas in the West, kings have serene, even temper. And by the way, these ideas and these, keep this in mind, these survived into our very day. You hear this in political views when we talk about rational actors in politics versus irrational actors. The Easterners are thought to be very ill-tempered, bad-tempered, passionate people thinking more with their hearts and emotions rather than their minds, whereas Westerners are thought to be thinking with their minds. They're very kind, yet they are very thoughtful and logical. Well, where does this come from, dear Polus? I have believed that one God has directed the course of history, and that it is only because of his mercy that we live at all. If we live in misery, it is because of our own uncontrolled passions. So that's his viewpoint. And by the way, I want to tell you that even in the ancient world, there was this idea that God brings punishment to sinners and God punishes an entire city if there are certain people in it. And we see this even in going back in time, although there is really no distinguishing of Eastern and Western people. There are references to cities being disobedient to the gods. For example, Haran in ancient Assyrian history being disobedient to Sin, Babylon being disobedient to Marduk, and so on. And therefore, the punishment comes. And also, of course, we see it in biblical lore. And we see it even in the writings of our Assyrian Christian fathers or Syriac Christian fathers who say, you know, the Assyrian Christians suffered the conquest by Islam because they had sinned. So when you do bad things, you endure bad outcomes. So again, I don't want to belabor this point. He definitely views Assyrian history through a Christian moral lens. And he definitely talks about decadence, decline, and the non-belief in God. So first and greatest early kingdom and empire. Again, Ninus and Semiramis are the legendary beginning of Assyria, pagan and ultimately doomed because Assyria was not believing in God in the ancient past. To show that war, pride, and ruin predate Christianity. So when Christianity comes, things get better. So there is much admiration for the greatness of the past, but there's also condemnation for what is done wrong. And just to kind of go back to Diodorus, our dear friend who kind of reinvented Semiramis for us. So the story is told by Diodorus, and this story has many surprises. Well, what is it exactly? What's the story of Semiramis? And there are various versions, I should tell you, but I'm going to just go through a couple of quick samples here. She's born in Ashkelon, a city on the Eastern Mediterranean, so in the Levant. Her mother was the Syrian goddess Dersito, who had fallen in love. Now, where does Dersito come from? It's thought to be a Targus, and perhaps linked with Astarte or Ishtar, according to some scholars. And she has an affair with a man, and she's ashamed of having a child with a mortal. So she abandons her baby in the wilderness, who is later found. That's baby Semiramis. And she transformed into a creature with the body of a fish and the head of a woman. The baby girl was kept alive by doves who fed her until she was found by a group of shepherds. There are various artworks on this theme. Their leader adopted her and named her Semiramis, which is in the Assyrian language, according to the story, meaning dove. So Samuramat. So what's the kind of the entirety of the story? Semiramis grows up among the shepherds after being abandoned as a baby. She becomes a very beautiful woman. Onus, an Assyrian officer traveling in the Levant, these are names given to Assyrians in the Greek legends, of course, sees her and falls in love. She marries him, and he brings her back to Assyria to rule. And during a military campaign in Bactria in eastern Iran, Semiramis shows brilliant military strategy and thinking. And she's drawing the attention of King Ninus, who we said was the first Assyrian ruler. Tragedy and royal marriage. Ninus desires her and forces her husband to kill himself. Ninus then marries her, making her queen. She becomes a ruler of the empire after he passes away, and she becomes the sole ruler of her kingdom. She leads military campaigns across Asia and expands the empire. And with these, there's this dark part of her story that she has many lovers and has killed them after one night. And it is said that thousands of mounds in the Near East were said to be of their graves. She has a divine ending. After her death, Semiramis is said to have ascended to heaven in the form of a dove, symbolizing her name and mythic status. And there's even a song by Linda George, kind of building on this legend, as it were. Now, again, going back to the original guy who wrote about her was Tasius. He wrote extensively and imaginatively about Semiramis. We don't see anything coming before that. We don't know where his information comes from. The account that he wrote is lost. Diodorus preserved it, and others kind of passed it on. And that's where we get the story of Semiramis. And she became legendary throughout Western circles, European circles. Here you see a sculpture by the American artist William Westmore and story. And he, of course, like many, admired Semiramis as being a legendary, very powerful queen, parallel with people like Alexander the Great and Napoleon. And she's also been featured by people like Dante, who wrote in the 14th century. And she's unfortunately burning in an inferno because of her sins. And he tells us in the play, in Inferno, the first of them, all you are to know that she who made vice of her virtue, Semiramis, empress of many tongues, her laws made lust licit in her own dominion to take away the blame she had incurred. So, not a very good person, according to Dante, but this is how characters are shaped in the story. Of course, not referring to any sort of historical evidence here. This is merely speculation on the part of Dante. Where he gets it, as we see, there's a long line coming down. And not to be outdone by these authors is the story of Moses, an Armenian writer writing in the early Christian centuries, Moses of Kroni, an Armenian historian who began to kind of form an Armenian story around the story of Semiramis. And this is where the story of Semiramis falling in love with Ara comes in. And this has also passed to the Assyrians in various forms. And it's interesting how people take one segment of the story. For example, growing up, I heard oftentimes people would talk about how Semiramis would, stop the Armenians from speaking their language for a period of 40 years. No evidence for that, where that comes from exactly. It's part of these stories. And so Assyrians would tell some part of the story, Armenians would tell another part of the story, one favorable to the first group, another favorable to the latter, and so on and so forth. Does this have any historical kind of underlying theme here? None. What's the story about? Really, it's kind of a Christian themed story about virtue and, again, decadence and war. So through the ages, the story of Semiramis has become a legendary story. It's become performed in various operas in the world, and people, of course, talk about Shamiram. And the Assyrians themselves have picked up a lot of these stories, shaping and reshaping and reformulating and kind of retelling the story of Shamiram from their own perspective. And one artist who has written about Shamiram, kind of a mythical story. Her story is called, her book is called Babylonia. It's a fictional account, of course, and Samuramit's is at the heart of this particular book by Costanza Casati, who is an artist, a very good artist. She tells us in an article on Semiramis, not much is known of Samuramit's reign, the original queen. It seems like a cruel joke, she says, for a woman who fought so hard to be remembered. Why is she saying that? Because she's one of the few women in Assyrian history who actually wrote her name or had her name written on actual Assyrian artifacts that survive to this day. And she tells us that there's a statue dedicated to the god Nabu that mentions her name in the ancient city of Nimrud or Kalhu, and an inscription in Turkey that alludes to the campaign she led with her son, a stele from the city of Ashur that reads, Samuramit, queen of Shamshi Adad, king of the universe, king of Assyria, mother of Adad Nirari, king of the universe, king of Assyria. So was she a person that we could point to? Of course, she was a living person. How much do we know about her? Where did Tasius and Herodotus and Diodorus and all of these people get their information? We don't exactly know, but we know she was a living and real person. And Costanza tells us that it seems like a cruel joke that a person so real, so powerful, so significant is not remembered properly. And of course, Hollywood has portrayed Semiramis based on a lot of these legends, but completely has gone off track. And there's a story that talks about we've got all the Oriental tropes that you want here. The Assyrians are conquerors and oppressors. The Assyrian king, identified as King Assur, is portrayed as the typical despotic ruler, cruel, decadent, lust-driven, and so on and so forth. He conquers Babylon, takes the city. The Assyrian court is shown as lavish and morally corrupt, and the Assyrians are, obviously not very good people. In fact, when the film begins, and I hope you, after we're finished with class, go and check this film, and I'd love to hear what you think about it maybe the next time. It's called The Queen of Babylon. There's a little distinction between the Assyrian elite and their armies. They're all depicted as agents of oppression over a native Babylonian or Chaldean population. So the history is completely made up. It's a very interesting history. So it's about violence and tyranny, romanticized Babylon versus vilified Assyria, villainized Assyria. And it's very inaccurate, historically inaccurate. Here you see the image of King Assur. Lots of interesting clothing. Much of it, if you're artistic, of course, is completely inaccurate. Even the sculptures, many of them are inaccurate, but although there are some good ones, I must say. Ashur is the name in reference to the Assyrian god and capital, but it is wrong as a historical name. Now, having heard all of these tales and having come to the age of nationalism, how did the Assyrians begin to reimagine Shamiram? And of course, there are many examples. These are two very interesting and prominent examples. The sculpture by Fred Parhad of Shamiram, which is today the head of the bust of the sculpture is at the Ashurbanipal Library in Lincolnwood, Illinois, and as is the painting of Queen Shamiram by Rennie Stefan, as is, by the way, a glass. I didn't feature it here, but a glass ornamental, large, very large ornamental glass work by Joseph Bedalpour, who's a stained glass. It's a large stained glass. I should have said that. And it's a re-evaluation of this great queen. So it's sort of drawing back to the ancient past and bringing back, unlike what has been done to Semiramis, kind of bringing back the good that survives in her character and kind of building on that, if you will. I want to end with this note, and I'm going to say more in the coming lectures about Berosus, who lived in Babylon and who was a native of Babylon. And he wrote in Greek, and he wrote about, and he is misunderstood. Again, this really pertains to today even. He was a Greek educated, so he was Hellenized. He was Greek educated, but he also knew cuneiform, one of the last people to know cuneiform in Babylon, in the entire country, because we don't have a lot of works in Babylon left, nor in Nineveh, nor in other places during these times, because the Assyrian Empire has fallen. The Seleucids are coming to an end, and the Parthians are about to come. And so Aramaic replaces Assyrian. But one person who tried to write the history of his people and the customs of his people, who was a native Mesopotamian, is Berosus. And he is completely misunderstood by some people who use him as kind of a Babylonian versus Assyrian or Chaldean versus Assyrian, and that's not the case. And we are going to get into this. He does not clearly distinguish between Assyrians and Chaldeans in the modern sense, and uses the term Chaldean really as a priestly class of people, not so much as an ethnic group. But this was in some way a small attempt to kind of come to grips with history, to kind of to recreate history from a native perspective. And this is one of the few that we have. And hopefully in the future, we will see more people like Berosus who try to tell their own story based on their native knowledge, but who didn't quite succeed into taking it into the modern centuries.